My daughter told me I will not get anything from my ex-wife's 20 million will. She sat there all happy during the will reading, but when the lawyer read one sentence, her face totally changed. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. First, let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Randolph Carl from Florida. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. I had been in that lawyer's office before, but never like this. In the early years, my ex-wife and I would sit together across from the same mahogany desk, reviewing contracts and signing deeds, both of us brimming with the kind of hope that only hard work and shared ambition can buy. This time, the air felt colder. The blinds were drawn halfway, letting in slits of late-morning light that cut across the carpet in uneven stripes. My daughter sat to my right, her arms folded, her chin lifted ever so slightly, like a queen surveying her court. She wouldn't look at me. I caught the way her lips curled, just enough to suggest that she already knew how this would play out, and in her mind, she was winning. I could almost hear her thoughts. That the man who had divorced her mother, who had abandoned the family, would be walking out of here with nothing. The lawyer, a thin man with rimless glasses and a voice as steady as a metronome, shuffled a thick stack of papers before him. I'd known him for years, too. He had a way of reading documents as though they were scripture, and in this moment, it almost felt like we were in a courtroom instead of a conference room. My daughter leaned back in her chair, her phone face down on the table, a display of self-control I knew was only because she wanted to appear dignified. Every movement of hers was calculated, and I felt the familiar sting in my chest, the one that came from realizing how much she resembled her mother, but without the warmth that used to soften the edges. He began reading, his voice carrying the formality of the law, each clause and provision landing like a gavel strike. I tuned out the early parts. There was talk of outstanding debts, smaller items to friends, the distribution of personal effects. My daughter's expression didn't change. She had rehearsed this in her mind, probably for months. I imagined her picturing herself as the sole heir, walking out with keys, deeds, and bank statements, finally proving her narrative that I had been nothing but a footnote in her mother's success story. Then, the sentence came. It was tucked neatly between legal jargon, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. To my former husband, who was instrumental in building and acquiring every asset I owned, I leave half of my properties, to be chosen at his discretion. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't known she would do this. My ex-wife and I hadn't spoken about the will in years. She'd never mentioned it during her illness, and I had no expectation, not after all the bitterness that had followed our divorce. But she had remembered. She had seen me, after all these years, not as an adversary, but as the man who had been there when it all began. The lawyer didn't pause, but I felt the air in the room shift. My daughter's shoulders tensed, her head jerked toward me, and her mouth opened slightly before snapping shut again. The smugness drained from her face, replaced by something raw, shock, maybe even fear. I kept my eyes forward, not because I didn't want to meet her gaze, but because I knew if I did, I'd see the resentment blooming in her like a wildfire. The next line came just as swiftly, and it carried its own kind of weight. The remaining half of my properties shall be donated to the Children's Relief Foundation, in accordance with my wishes to leave a legacy beyond material gain. There was no mention of my daughter, not a token sum, not a sentimental keepsake, nothing. I could feel her glare on me, burning through the side of my head, but I didn't move. I wasn't gloating. God knows I didn't come here to see her humiliated. But there was a cold truth settling in my bones. She had built her expectations on an inheritance she never earned, and now that foundation had crumbled in seconds. When the lawyer closed the folder, the room felt heavier. My daughter spoke first, her voice sharp and cracking at the edges. "You did this." I turned to her, finally meeting her eyes. I didn't even know what was in the will. She leaned forward, her knuckles white against the table. "Don't lie to me. You convinced her." "You." I didn't convince anyone, I said, my voice calm but low. Your mother made her own choices. You might not agree with them, but they were hers. Her face flushed red. She wouldn't have done this unless you. Unless what? I cut in. Unless I reminded her that I was there when she had nothing? Unless I remembered her as more than a bank account? Your mother wasn't the type to be told what to do. Not by me, not by anyone. You should know that better than anyone. The lawyer cleared his throat, offering a polite but firm reminder that the meeting was over. My daughter grabbed her phone, her chair scraping back with a screech, and stormed toward the door without looking back. I watched her leave, the echo of her footsteps fading in the hallway. I stayed seated for a while, staring at the grain of the wood in the table. The gratitude I felt toward my ex-wife was tangled with something darker, a sadness that the one person I thought would stand by me through anything had chosen to see me as the enemy. The inheritance didn't feel like a victory. It felt like proof that even after decades, love and loyalty could still be so easily rewritten in someone else's mind. When I finally stepped outside, the sunlight hit me hard, too bright after the dimness inside. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like I had just walked away from something that couldn't be repaired. And in a way, I had. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen filling the silence like a low, constant warning. My mind kept circling back to the look on my daughter's face at the will reading. The way her certainty had collapsed in an instant. It wasn't just anger I'd seen. It was betrayal, as if I'd stolen something sacred from her. But the truth was, she had stolen that belief from herself long before today, by deciding I was her adversary instead of her father. I had gone over every interaction we'd had in recent years, her clipped responses to my calls, the missed holidays, the way she only reached out when she needed money. Part of me wondered if I had ignored the signs because it was easier than facing the possibility that my own child didn't see me as family anymore. By morning, the anger had replaced the sleepless haze. Not the explosive, shouting kind, but the cold, steady kind that makes you aware of every heartbeat. I made myself coffee and sat at the table, staring into the steam. I thought about calling her. About trying to explain that I hadn't known about the will, that her mother's decision had blindsided me just as much. But then I pictured her voice, sharp and dripping with accusation, and I knew it wouldn't matter. She had already written the story in her mind, and in her version, I was the villain. I didn't have the energy to play the part anymore. Still, out of habit more than hope, I dialed her number. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. 3 days passed without a word from her. I went about my routines, checking on the rental properties, signing paperwork from the lawyer, meeting with the charity representative about transferring the other half of my ex-wife's estate. But everything felt muted, like I was living in a house where the windows had been boarded shut. On the 4th day, I heard from her, but not in the way I expected. I was coming back from the grocery store when a man in a navy suit stepped out of a black sedan in front of my driveway, holding an envelope. He didn't smile, didn't introduce himself beyond a clipped "Mr. Harris" before handing it over. The words on the front were enough to make my stomach turn. Notice of civil action. I sat in my car for a long time before opening it. The papers inside spelled it out in blunt, clinical language. My daughter was suing me for fraudulent interference and undue influence over her mother's will. She was claiming that I had manipulated my ex-wife into cutting her out and leaving me the majority share. I read the document 3 times, each pass making my pulse louder in my ears. This wasn't a fight in a living room or a shouting match in a driveway. This was a war she was willing to put in front of strangers, witnesses, and a judge. That night, my phone lit up with a text from her. You stole my future. I'm going to prove it. No greeting, no hesitation, just those words. I stared at the message until the screen went black, feeling the hollowness inside me grow deeper. She didn't ask why. She didn't even pretend to want my side of the story. All she saw was a prize she thought belonged to her, and the person standing in her way. My lawyer, David, called me the next morning after reviewing the documents. His voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying disapproval. She doesn't have much of a case, he said. The will was airtight, and there's plenty of documentation proving your contributions to those properties. But she's angry. Angry people drag these things out, even when they know they're going to lose. I told him I didn't want to fight her in court, that maybe there was a way to settle quietly. He paused for a moment before answering. You can offer to mediate, but from the tone of this filing, she's not looking for compromise. She wants to make you the bad guy. She wants to win in her own head, even if she loses here. The first hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Word traveled fast in our family, faster than I'd have liked. My sister called, her voice hesitant. I'm not taking sides, but why she's saying you connived with the lawyer? People are talking. People were always talking. Neighbors who once waved at me in the mornings now looked away when I passed by. I could feel the judgment in their eyes, not because they believed her entirely, but because scandal was more interesting than the truth. As the days passed, I stopped trying to call her. I told myself it was because I needed to focus on the legal case, but deep down, I knew it was because every unanswered ring was another cut I didn't want to feel. Instead, I started documenting everything. Old photos, property records, tax documents from the years my ex-wife and I built our assets together. Each piece of paper felt like a reminder of the life we'd once shared and the one my daughter had chosen to throw away. The night before the hearing, I sat at the kitchen table with David, going over testimony. He reminded me to stick to the facts, to avoid letting my emotions turn into outbursts. I nodded along, but inside, I felt the slow boil of resentment. I had spent my life working to provide, to build something that would outlast me. And now my own child was trying to burn it all down because she couldn't stand the thought that I had earned what I had been given. When he left, I poured myself a drink and stood by the window, watching the dark street outside. Somewhere out there, my daughter was probably telling herself she was fighting for justice. But I knew the truth. This wasn't about justice. It was about control. And if she thought dragging me through court would make me surrender, she was going to learn just how stubborn her father could be. The courthouse had that same faint smell of old paper and floor polish I remembered from jury duty years ago, except now. Every sound seemed sharper, every glance more loaded. I arrived early, partly because my lawyer insisted, but also because I didn't want to walk in and feel her eyes on me from across the hallway. David met me at the steps, carrying a leather briefcase and that air of unshakable calm I had learned to lean on. Remember, he said quietly as we walked inside, this isn't about convincing her. It's about proving the truth to the court. His voice was steady, but I could feel the weight behind the words. He knew as well as I did that truth and perception weren't always the same thing. And in cases like this, perception could leave deeper scars than any ruling. Inside the courtroom, I spotted her immediately. My daughter sat next to her attorney, wearing a fitted black dress and a necklace I remembered buying her for her 21st birthday. She didn't look at me, but I could see the way her jaw tensed when I took my seat. The room filled with a low murmur as the judge entered, and then silence fell, heavy and absolute. Her lawyer stood first, speaking with the kind of rehearsed conviction that comes from knowing your case is thin, but your performance must be strong. He painted a picture of a grieving daughter blindsided by a scheming ex-husband, how I had allegedly used my past relationship to manipulate my ex-wife in her final months, coercing her into rewriting her will. Every sentence felt like a deliberate twist of the knife, designed not just to sway the judge, but to humiliate me. David countered with precision. He laid out records, photos, and documents from decades back, proof of my role in acquiring and maintaining the properties. He called witnesses who had known both me and my ex-wife, people who testified that she was fiercely independent and made her own decisions without influence. Each time David presented another piece of evidence, I watched my daughter's face harden. She wasn't reacting to the facts. She was reacting to the narrative she'd built in her mind being dismantled, brick by brick. I wanted to look at her, to somehow make her understand that I hadn't taken anything from her. But the courtroom wasn't the place for personal pleas. It was a place for facts, and facts don't heal wounds. During a recess, I stepped into the hallway to breathe. That's when I overheard them. A couple of distant cousins were standing near the vending machines, their voices hushed, but not enough to escape me. "Well, you know how he is," one said. always did have a way of getting what he wanted. The other chuckled softly, as if the outcome was already certain. They didn't see me walk past, but their words stuck. It wasn't just my daughter I was fighting. It was a tide of quiet judgment from people who didn't care to know the whole truth. They just liked the drama, and I had become the villain in their story too. Back in the courtroom, her lawyer tried to introduce a letter my ex-wife had written to a friend months before her death. It hinted at gratitude toward me, but also mentioned unfinished matters with our daughter. He spun it as evidence of manipulation and pressure, but David quickly objected. The judge sustained it, and the letter was struck from the record. Still, the damage lingered. The words had been spoken aloud, and I could see the way my daughter clung to them, like they were proof of something real. When the session ended for the day, I gathered my things slowly, hoping to avoid any hallway confrontation. But she was waiting near the exit. "You think you're so clever," she said under her breath, her voice trembling with rage. "You think hiding behind lawyers makes you right?" I looked at her for the first time all day. This isn't about being clever. It's about telling the truth. Whether you want to believe it or not is up to you. Her eyes glistened, not with grief, but with the sting of pride. "You took everything from me. You'll see." She turned sharply and walked away before I could respond, her heels clicking against the marble like punctuation marks on a threat. That night, my phone lit up again, not with a text from her, but with a voicemail from a mutual friend. His voice was hesitant. "Look, man, she's talking to people. Posting stuff online about how you cheated her out of her inheritance. I don't know if you care, but people are listening." I did care, though I wished I didn't. Every rumor, every post, every whispered conversation felt like a slow erosion of the life I had built, not just financially, but the version of myself I had always believed my daughter saw. The second day of hearings was worse. Her side called a family friend to testify, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. They claimed I had a history of controlling behavior during my marriage, painting me as a man who needed to have the final say in everything. It wasn't true, not in the way they told it, but I knew the image they were crafting. David dismantled it methodically, but I could feel the damage in the room, the way certain words stuck even after being discredited. That's the thing about accusations. They're like smoke. Even when you prove there's no fire, the smell lingers. By the end of the week, I was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The case was still ongoing, but I already knew the truth. Even if I won in court, I had lost something I could never get back. The bond between a father and daughter, fragile as it had been, was gone completely, and no ruling from a judge could restore it. The morning of the verdict, the air outside the courthouse felt unnaturally still, as if the entire city had paused to hold its breath. I arrived earlier than I needed to, more out of habit than necessity. The weeks of hearings had left me in a constant state of readiness. Documents in order, testimony rehearsed, my composure ironed flat like a pressed shirt. David met me inside, offering a brief nod instead of small talk. By this point, we both understood there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in filings, witness statements, and cross-examinations. The judge would make their ruling today, and whatever happened, it would be final. I told myself that I was prepared for either outcome, but the truth was, I had only ever imagined two versions of this moment: vindication or the crushing weight of being wrongfully condemned by both the law and my own child. The courtroom felt smaller than usual, the air thicker. My daughter was already seated when I walked in, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore no jewelry today, no makeup beyond a touch of mascara. It was the kind of calculated choice I recognized immediately, an attempt to look understated, vulnerable, the wronged party. I sat without acknowledging her, fixing my eyes on the bench where the judge would soon appear. The murmur of the room quieted when the bailiff announced the judge's entrance, and everyone rose. The scrape of chairs against the floor as we sat again sounded louder than it should have, an almost jarring reminder that the world kept moving even when your life was about to change. The judge's voice was measured, calm, almost clinical as they began reading the decision. They reviewed the arguments from both sides, citing specific points of law and the evidence, or lack thereof, that supported each claim. I listened with an even expression, though inside, every word landed like a drumbeat in my chest. The judge noted the extensive documentation of my contributions to the properties, the testimony that my ex-wife had been independent in her decisions, and the absence of any credible evidence to support claims of undue influence. When the final words came, the court finds in favor of the respondent. I felt my chest expand as if I had been holding my breath for weeks without realizing it. The legal weight was gone, but it left behind an emptiness I couldn't quite name. I didn't look at my daughter immediately. Part of me wanted to see her reaction, but another part of me feared what I would find there. When I finally did glance over, she wasn't crying. She wasn't even looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the table in front of her, her jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitch. This wasn't grief, it was defiance. She had lost the case, but she hadn't lost her belief that I had somehow cheated her. In her mind, the verdict wasn't truth. It was just another injustice, proof that the world was on my side. I realized then that the fight wasn't truly over. It had simply changed forms. As we left the courtroom, reporters waited outside, their microphones thrust forward like spears. "Mr. Harris, any comment on the ruling?" one asked. "Do you have anything to say to your daughter?" another pressed. I kept walking, the sound of their voices fading as I descended the courthouse steps. David stayed close, steering me toward the street where my car was parked. "You handled that well," he said quietly. I nodded, but the praise felt hollow. Winning a case like this was supposed to feel like relief, maybe even triumph. Instead, it felt like standing in the ruins of something that could never be rebuilt. That night, my house was quiet in a way that felt heavier than usual. I poured a drink and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the verdict papers as if they might suddenly rearrange themselves into a different outcome. I thought about calling her, just to say that despite everything, I still wish things had been different. But then I remembered the text she had sent weeks earlier, the venom in her voice outside the courtroom, the way she had been willing to drag me through public humiliation to get what she thought she was owed. I put the phone down without dialing. Some words, once spoken, couldn't be taken back, and some silences were better left unbroken. The following day, the fallout began. Mutual friends stopped reaching out, unsure which side to be on. A few congratulated me quietly, as if the act of showing support was dangerous. Family group chats went silent. I heard from a neighbor that my daughter had posted on social media, calling the verdict corruption in action and claiming that I had stolen her birthright. It didn't matter that the court had sided with me. In the court of public opinion, perception outweighed evidence, and she was determined to play the victim until the end. I could have defended myself publicly, but I didn't. Let people think what they wanted. I had nothing left to prove. Later that week, I drove past the office building where my ex-wife and I had once signed our very first property deal. The memory hit me with an almost physical force, the excitement in her eyes, the way she'd gripped my hand under the table as we signed the final papers. Back then, it felt like we were building something permanent, something that would outlast us both. But permanence, I had learned, was an illusion. People change. Loyalties shift. And sometimes, the person you thought you were building a future for turns out to be the one trying to tear it all down. By the end of that month, I knew what I had to do. Winning in court was one thing. Protecting myself from further betrayal was another. I began taking steps to ensure that whatever remained of my own estate would be out of her reach entirely. It wasn't about revenge, it was about survival. She had already shown me how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted, and I wasn't going to give her another opportunity. I had weathered the storm, but I wasn't about to stand on the shore waiting for the next one to hit. It's strange how final decisions don't always come with fireworks. Sometimes they arrive quietly, like a slow-moving storm you've been watching on the horizon for weeks. The morning I decided to cut my daughter out of my life entirely, I was drinking coffee in the kitchen, sunlight spilling across the table. I'd been going over my own will, something I hadn't looked at in years, and the words blurred as I thought about what would happen if I died tomorrow. Would she come to the funeral grieving, or would she come calculating what she stood to gain? The thought made my stomach turn. I realized then that my trust in her was gone. Not fractured, not damaged, but completely erased. Trust, I've learned, doesn't rebuild itself once it's been burned to the ground. I called my attorney first. David didn't sound surprised when I told him I wanted to amend my will and remove her from any claim to my estate. "I'll prepare the paperwork," he said simply. There was no judgment in his tone, no hesitation, as though he understood that this was the only logical step left. Logic was the easy part. The harder part was accepting that this wasn't just a legal move. It was the severing of the last thread that connected us. I thought about the small box in my closet filled with things she'd made me when she was little: crayon drawings, Father's Day cards with messy handwriting, photos of us at the park. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away, but I knew keeping her in my will out of sentimentality would only invite more pain later. That afternoon, I went to the bank to close a joint account we had opened years ago when she was in college. It hadn't been used in a long time, but her name was still on it. The teller looked at me over the counter, asking the routine security questions, unaware that she was witnessing the quiet end of something significant. When she slid the final closure form toward me, I hesitated for just a moment before signing. My name looked foreign next to hers now, like it belonged on two entirely separate lives that had nothing to do with each other. The pen left a faint smudge of ink on my hand, and I wiped it away as if that could erase the history too. A week later, I sent her a single letter. I didn't want there to be any confusion about where we stood, and I didn't want my silence to be misinterpreted as indecision. I kept it short, under a page, but every word was deliberate. I told her that her actions during the lawsuit had destroyed my trust completely. That trust, once lost, could not be rebuilt. I informed her that she was no longer in my will, that all financial ties between us were now severed, and that there would be no further contact. I didn't threaten, didn't insult, didn't try to make her understand. It wasn't a letter written for reconciliation, it was written for clarity. I sealed it in a plain envelope, knowing that when she opened it, she would feel the finality as surely as I did. When she received the letter, she didn't call. Instead, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she'd posted about it online, claiming I was punishing her for standing up for herself. She told anyone who would listen that I was vindictive, that I had chosen money over family. I didn't respond. By then, I had stopped defending myself. People will believe what they want to believe, and those determined to see you as the villain will always find a way to make the story fit. My silence wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a refusal to keep playing a game that had no ending except destruction. In the days that followed, I felt something unexpected: relief. It wasn't the triumphant kind, but a quieter sense of release. I no longer had to brace myself for her calls or texts dripping with accusation. I didn't have to wonder when the next demand or insult would arrive. My phone was silent, my days free from the constant pull of a relationship that had become more about damage control than love. Yet, beneath that relief, there was still an ache. Cutting her off didn't erase the fact that she was my daughter, or that once, long ago, she had run into my arms with unfiltered joy. The ache was the ghost of what might have been, if greed and resentment hadn't gotten in the way. Friends had mixed reactions when I told them what I'd done. Some called me strong for standing my ground. Others hinted that maybe I should have tried one more time to make peace. But none of them had been in that courtroom. None of them had seen the way she had looked at me, as though I were nothing but an obstacle to be destroyed. Family isn't defined by blood alone. Family is loyalty, trust, and the willingness to see each other as more than the worst thing you've ever done. Without those, you're just two people with shared DNA and nothing else. One evening, I drove past her street, not to see her, but because it was the fastest route home. Her car was in the driveway, lights on inside. For a brief moment, I thought about stopping, knocking on the door, and trying one last time to bridge the gap. But I kept driving, not out of spite, but because I finally understood that some bridges aren't worth crossing if the only thing waiting on the other side is more pain. I had already given her every chance I could without losing myself in the process. This time, I chose me. Months passed before I could drive past the lawyer's office without feeling that familiar tightness in my chest. Time has a way of softening certain memories, but others remain as sharp as the day they happened. The will reading, the lawsuit, the verdict, those moments still lived just beneath the surface, ready to rise at the smallest trigger. And yet, as the seasons changed, so did I. I found myself looking less at the loss and more at what had been preserved. Dignity, peace, the knowledge that I had honored my ex-wife's wishes, even when it came at the cost of my relationship with my daughter. Some people might call that cold. I call it survival. One late afternoon, I drove out to the edge of town, where one of the properties now solely in my name overlooked the river. My ex-wife and I had bought it in the early years, before the business took off. We'd stood on that same bluff, the water shimmering below us, and imagined the life we were building. Standing there now, alone, I could almost hear her voice in the wind, not in words but in the way she used to look at me when we accomplished something together. She hadn't owed me anything when she died, yet she'd still chosen to acknowledge what we had built side by side. That was worth more than the land, the money, or the house that sat a few yards behind me. It was proof that, at least in her eyes, I hadn't been erased. Of course, the absence of my daughter was a shadow that followed me everywhere. It wasn't the loud, daily kind of pain anymore. It was a quieter ache, like an old injury that throbs when the weather turns. Sometimes I would pass a store window and catch sight of a necklace or a book she might have liked. For a moment, my hand would twitch toward my wallet, before the reality set back in. Gifts were for people who wanted to be in your life, not for those who saw you as nothing more than a vault to be emptied. That truth didn't make the ache go away, but it made it bearable. Friends still brought her up from time to time, usually in cautious tones, as though the wrong phrasing might shatter me. Some couldn't understand how I could go months without speaking to my only child. I didn't bother explaining to them that the silence wasn't just absence, it was protection. Every time I imagined reopening the door, I remembered her in that courtroom, eyes cold, voice dripping with accusation. I remembered the sting of being portrayed as a manipulator, a thief, in front of strangers and family alike. Some wounds aren't meant to be reopened, because what spills out isn't just blood, it's trust, and once it's gone, it doesn't come back. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and gold, I sat on my porch with a glass of whiskey, thinking about legacies. My ex-wife had left half of what she owned to a children's charity, a decision I respected more with each passing day. She'd chosen to invest in something that would outlast both of us. I'd followed suit in my own updated will, leaving much of what I had to causes I believed in. It wasn't about denying my daughter out of spite. It was about making sure what I'd built went somewhere it would be valued. In a way, I was honoring her mother's example. The strangest part of all this was the clarity it gave me. Before, I'd always imagined my final years surrounded by family, my daughter at the center of it. But life has a way of stripping away illusions until you're left with what's real, even if it's not what you wanted. What was real for me now was that I could live the rest of my life without the constant undercurrent of conflict. I could wake up in the morning without wondering when the next accusation would land. I could choose who had access to my time, my energy, and my resources, and I chose to keep those gates closed to her. Some nights, I still dream about her as a child, running toward me in the park with grass stains on her knees and a smile so wide it could split the sky. In those dreams, I always catch her in my arms, spin her around, and hear her laughter echo against the trees. Then I wake up, and the silence reminds me that those days are gone. But instead of mourning them endlessly, I've learned to carry them like a photograph, frozen in time, untouchable by the bitterness that came after. That's the version of her I'll keep. Not the one who sued me. Not the one who cut me down in front of strangers. The one who once loved me without calculation. The truth is, I don't hate her. I don't wish her harm. I just no longer wish her near. There's a difference between holding on to anger and holding on to boundaries. Anger burns you alive. Boundaries keep you standing when the storm passes. My choice to cut her off wasn't about revenge. It was about refusing to stand in a place where I could be struck again. If she ever decides to reach out with genuine remorse, that will be her choice. But I've stopped waiting for it. In the end, life isn't measured by who you keep in it at all costs. It's measured by the peace you preserve by letting go of those who are willing to destroy you to get what they want. I've made my choice, and I can live with it. Sometimes, winning doesn't feel like winning. It just feels like surviving. I chose peace over blood ties, and I'd do it again. If you were in my place, would you have cut your child off completely after a betrayal like this? Or would you keep the door open, even knowing what they're capable of? Tell me what you'd do, because in the end, family isn't about shared DNA. It's about shared respect. See you soon in the next story.